All right, good morning, everyone. We'll resume the hearing, and at this stage, I'm hearing from submitters Pauline, Judy, Smythe, and Mary. I understand you're representing your parents this morning.
That's correct.
And Ms. Hugavin, is that correct way to say your name? Okay. All right, so I'll just pass over to you. Just to let you know, I've read your pre-circulated evidence, so you don't need to read that out loud to me, but you're very welcome to highlight key points and to add additional information for my benefit this morning. And if Mary Smythe wants to speak as well, then very happy about that. But over to both of you.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. I won't read my evidence in chief, however, I will summarise the key points. Since preparing this evidence, I've reflected on the memorandum in council for both the council and the plan change proponent, and the supplementary evidence of the council planner and the plan change proponent. The key points raised in my evidence in chief related to the following matter: whether this new notation on the outline development plan is the most appropriate method to achieve the future-proof road widening objective. In this regard, I consider that there was no Section 32 analysis of the range of methods available to achieve that road widening objective, and instead it simply reviewed how one method, being the ODP notation, could be applied to the land in different ways. And this was done at the Section 42A reporting stage. In my evidence, I listed other planning methods that are available to protect land for road widening. However, these are not preferred by the submitter, except perhaps a designation which does sit outside this process. In my evidence, I also raised the matter of uncertainty, which is a very real matter for the current landowners. Even if a future designation were applied to the land, there is no certainty as to when. It is my view that a notation on an outline development plan for road widening as part of a private plan change process is not an appropriate vehicle to quarantine land for the future proofing of a road and corridor for a possible future residential growth area that has a potential timeline of up to 30 years away. And I don't use the word quarantine lightly, as in practice, when thinking of future industrial development, the land subject to the outline development plan, road widening notation, can't be used for services, access, buildings, storage, or parking without a discretionary activity consent. It has more than just consenting implications for the current landowners, but also future industrial owners and what they see as usable industrial land. In my experience, road widening is generally done by a notice of requirement or designation, and that this is good planning practice, particularly when the land is that of a third party and the land take is a significant size. In this case, it represents about 10% of the Smythe's property, including their house and ancillary buildings. That's almost half a hectare. As acknowledged in the legal submissions for the council, this has the benefit, or designation has the benefit of enabling applications to be made under Section 185 of the RMA, which is relevant to the current landowners for the reasons Ms. Smythe will talk to. It also enables the full suite of compensatory sections of Part 5 of the Public Works Act to be applied rather than just Section 60, which I understand is only available when the land is actually taken or acquired for the public work. And I think that the legal counsel in the room may be able to provide more advice on this to the Commissioner. Notwithstanding the personal circumstances of the Smythe family at this time, I do not consider that it would be practical for a landowner to retain the land in the face of an emerging industrial landscape to see the compensation at the time the council actually takes or acquires the land, being some 10 to 30 years from now. For these reasons, it's my view that road widening by way of a notation on an outline development plan of a private plan change where it affects the land of a third party is not the most appropriate method, as it significantly impacts the use of the property, but provides no recourse to the current owners, particularly noting the personal circumstances that apply in this case, which Ms. Smythe will talk to. This process may be an efficient method to set aside land for future road widening, and I acknowledge that. However, the social and economic cost to a third party as a result has not been quantified, and there is insufficient information about alternative methods as the required statutory analysis has not been done. Designations are a very effective road widening tool and is the more appropriate method in my view. Notices of requirement can be an efficient planning process, as they're sort of like a resource consent. As the council seem quite certain that Upper Belk Road development will occur, then a designation would be more appropriate to secure the land required and provides a fairer process for the current landowners. Overall, the road widening notation on the ODP has not been subject to the required statutory assessment, in my opinion, and I consider that the risk of acting, that is, of retaining the notation in the plan change, is significant because there is insufficient information about the subject matter of the provisions on the social and economic effects on the Smythes and other landowners subject to this who aren't here at the hearing. Consequently, the road widening notation should be removed from the eastern side of Belk Road. I note that this would not have a material effect on the rezoning of the subject plan change area, and that this would not affect that. However, it would enable the council time to undertake the required statutory assessment. In the meantime, it would be unlikely that the future road corridor would be compromised unless the council delays taking action. I welcome any questions.
Yeah, thank you for that. So just let me clarify in my mind. So your para 4.6, you outline methods that could be used to delineate the road widening, building line setbacks, road boundary yard adjustments, and a designation. And I think you said in your verbal presentation that the submitter you represent doesn't prefer the building line setbacks or the road boundary yard requirements, but instead prefers a designation.
When I set those out in my evidence, it was mainly because to point out that other options haven't been explored. And I think in this case, there's the objective, which we all understand, and I don't think there's a lot of disagreement about what the objective is. But that the first method has been explored and not other methods to achieve the same thing. And in that case, the method has been applied in different ways and looked at how that could be applied to the land. So the other side of the road, lesser, wider. And in that case, I think there hasn't been that process of assessment at looking at if you did a building line restriction on both sides of the road, that might be more palatable because it would be less land affected, but that hasn't been explored. So that was really my reason for raising those matters.
Right, but just to be crystal clear in my mind, the submitter you represent doesn't prefer either a building line setback option or a road boundary yard requirements for future industrial development. Okay. So I guess the issue then in front of me is whether or not it's appropriate at this stage to indicate road widening of Belk Road. Obviously, a designation is not an available instrument that I can require at this stage, certainly not for a private plan change. And so if road widening is to be indicated at this stage, then it's really a Hobson's choice. It's the ODP or nothing. I mean, I'm familiar with other developments similar to this in other parts of New Zealand, private plan changes, rezoning requests and outline development plans are a commonly used instrument, and they quite commonly indicate roads, new roads and existing roads that will be widened. Yep, including on land that's privately owned. So it is a commonly used instrument.
Come across it recently to this extent.
Sorry, I think you need to just...
Sorry, that was loud. I haven't come across it recently to this extent over a third party that hasn't been actively involved in the plan change. A recent example is Ladies Mile in Queenstown, where there is a structure plan as part of that rezoning, and that indicated road and footpaths and cycleways and amenity, but all of those parties were actively involved in the plan change.
So is it your evidence to me that the Smythes as property owners haven't been consulted by the proponent?
No.
No, they haven't been consulted, or no, that's not your evidence? Okay. So what do you mean by actively involved?
Sorry, Mary.
No, sorry, this is planning evidence.
Planning, yeah. In terms of that recent example in Queenstown, all of those landowners were in favour, I guess, of providing cycleways and walkways over their private land.
But that's different than not being actively involved.
And they were actively involved in the plan change process from a very early stage, before the plan change was even notified.
In what capacity? Just in terms of the consultative process?
Council put out master plans for Ladies Mile. The submitters in that process were involved master plan right through to the inception of the publicly led plan change process, and then we're involved right through the hearing.
Yep. Okay. All right, thank you.
Good morning, Commissioner. I have printed copies of my submissions that I'm going to make today, together with the appendices that I'd like the parties to refer to. Would you like me to distribute those to yourself and to anyone else that would like a copy? Wonderful.
So just while that's been handed out, are you able to email a copy of that, a digital copy to the council, and then they can provide it to me?
Absolutely.
Yep, thank you.
Hannah will do that for you now.
All right, ready to go?
Just to introduce myself again to the Commissioner and also for the benefit of everyone else who is here today, my name is Mary Smythe. I am the daughter of Paul and Judy Smythe, the landowners of 171 Balk Road, comprised in lots 1 and 2 of DP 800-57. I appear today on behalf of my parents and our family. My father is unfortunately unable to present himself today, and I'll come to the reason for that later. Just to clarify for your benefit to the Commissioner, the gentleman at the end of the table next to my mother is a family friend as opposed to my father. I am a lawyer, but I do not appear today as legal counsel. I am here in a personal capacity, representing my parents and our family at large. So just to summarise our position, my parents do not wish to challenge the proposed rezoning of the property from rural to industrial under the proposed private plan change 35. However, they do not support the proposed road widening notation in the outline development plan, and they request that it is removed from their property. In regards to the rezoning, it is important to mention that my parents do not wish for their land to be rezoned and for their quiet enjoyment and rural environment to be disturbed in the manner it has been. However, they are realistic about their limited ability to challenge the stage 4 rezoning, given the significant scale of the industrial development which has been progressed around them, and it became evident when their land was brought into Tauranga City's jurisdiction last year, a precursor to this plan change, that they would have limited ability to fight the rezoning. Despite their reluctant and somewhat forced acceptance of this, it is exceptionally difficult, for reasons I will come to later, to accept that a bulldozer will go through their property and home in the near future. My submissions today will focus on the proposed road widening notation in the ODP and the current proposal to take an 18-metre strip comprising almost half an acre of land for future road widening from their land. Sorry, just to clarify, half a hectare, not half an acre. This is the aspect of the plan change that they do not support. Before I address the detailed submissions that I would like to make, I would like to provide the Commissioner with some historical and environmental context to my parents' property and the significance that it has to them and to the family at large. My parents, now in their 70s, have owned their property since 1976 for 48 years. My father acquired the land, then remote rural land, in his mid-20s as a plot of bare land with no services or infrastructure. He scrimped and saved, working multiple jobs to make the purchase. It was purchased with the intention of building and providing a home on the property to raise and ensure the quiet enjoyment of his growing family. My mother, pregnant at the time with my older twin brothers. Since that date, my father has spent the last 48 years improving the land and turning it into what it is today, a lovely home and beautifully landscaped 4.6 hectare property to be showcased in the upcoming Tauranga Garden and Arts Festival. And I refer people to Appendix 1. He built the 5-bedroom home himself over a number of years, spending many weekends taking his young family to demolition homes or demolition auctions to secure timber, joinery, fixtures and fittings at a price that he could afford. I refer people to the images contained within Appendix 2. You'll see photos of when my father was building the home, and then you'll see photos of what the home and the property is today. Beyond the home, every outbuilding structure, landscaping element, and service infrastructure he designed, conceptualized, and built together with my mother. Every tree planted, brick placed, nail hammered, floorboard laid, every single improvement on the land, he did it himself. Outside of his working life and raising his family, improvement of the property and creation of what stands there today has quite literally been his life's work. What stands there is my father's legacy, created with his own bare hands. To the applicant and to Tauranga Council, the property and the home on it is just 2 titles marked on a rudimentary plan that will at some point in the future be part of a giant industrial estate, a plot of land with a factory or perhaps some storage sheds on it. To my parents, it is their family home of 48 years, the place where they raised 4 children, hosted family weddings and all significant family events, the place that their 9 grandchildren are brought home to, the place where their entire adult lives have been lived and enjoyed. The emotional attachment to the land and the property for my parents and our family is enormous. Financially, it is my parents' only asset. It is valuable on all metrics. The 4.6 hectares of land is comprised in 2 titles. My father having subdivided the land in 2014 to enable them to be able to sell off some of the land in their retirement years and remain living on the balance. To this end, much time, money, and effort was spent on subdivision and creation of shared easements, such as drainage easements, to ensure independence and value of the separate lots. My parents currently own both titles, but that could change at any time. I refer people to Appendix 3, which has a copy of the survey plan depicting the 2 lots and the shared drainage and service easements. From a topography and land contour perspective, all of Lot 1 is flat land. 2/3 of Lot 2 is flat land, and 1/3 of Lot 2 has a large hill on it, which runs the length of the rear boundary. There is some imagery of the hillside in Appendix 4. The balance of Bulk Road continues from the top of the hill at that elevated plane, forming the beginning of what is referred to as Upper Bulk Road. This hill is not present on the western side of the road. I'll now turn to our specific submissions and why my parents and their planning consultants have challenged the road widening notation in the ODP and sought its removal from the plan change. Firstly, we do not believe that due process has been followed by the applicant or council in respect to the proposed road widening notation on my parents' land. The proposed notation as it affects their land is material. It affects roughly 10% of their land, being a large area of approximately half a hectare. Cuts right through the middle of their home. I was reflecting on this when I was standing at the bathroom sink today, brushing my teeth, and thinking, this is an area currently proposed for roading. It deletes a secondary building, large in size, which comprises the garage, my father's office, and the place where my mother runs her business from, and deletes shared service easements in place to ensure independence of two subdivided lots. I refer parties to Appendix 5 and Appendix 3 in this regard. Where such a material and significant land take is proposed, a proper public planning process should be undertaken, which looks at all available access and road widening alternatives before any access route and road take is identified and recommended. The impacted party should be notified directly and a formal process of consultation had, and I would argue from early stage. At no time have my parents been formally and directly notified of a proposal to take an 18-metre strip of their land for future road widening, or invited to participate in a robust and planning and consultation process. They were never served with any direct notice of this plan change and the proposed roading notation, i.e. by email or mail. My father first learned of the proposal to set aside 18 metres of land on Bulk Road for future road widening by default, when it was mentioned at a public meeting held by the applicant with Bulk Road residents in early December 2020. At that time, it was a generic statement made by the applicant. You just have to excuse me for a moment. So at that time, it was a generic statement made by the applicant and did not identify a specific proposal to take it from the eastern side of the road where my parents' property is located. It was also caveated by a statement that it was highly unlikely that the 38-metre road widening corridor would be required in the medium term, but was intended as future-proofing at the request of Tauranga City Council for future Upper Bulk Road residential development. From this time, my father has initiated all inquiry and information requests with Tauranga Council, having been prompted to do so when a Collier's agent turned up at their property in January 2023, and note that that was a year and a half ago, to present an unsolicited off-market purchase offer for their land from an undisclosed party, which attached a proposed industrial development plan of the property showing an 18-metre strip along their road boundary set aside for road widening, and a value analysis run with this land deducted, and a copy of the development plan that was annexed to that offer is included as Appendix 6. This was rather curious at the time, where this information that my parents had no prior knowledge had come from, and why a development plan showed the 18-metre strip taken from my parents' land. To highlight the curious nature of this further, it is important to note that 1, the ODP in the proposed road widening notation was only publicly notified in March this year, a year and a half after the presentation of this offer showing road widening on their property. 2, the assessment of effects in respect to the Bulk road widening and Council's resultant recommendation that the land come from my parents' land was only undertaken by Council and disclosed as part of the Section 42A hearing report publicly notified only 3 weeks ago. And 3, at no time has my father, being the landowner, received any form of direct notice that the applicant and Tauranga City Council intended to take the 18 metres from his land, let alone provision of a formal notice of requirement. My father has requested meetings with Council roading engineers and Anne Tolley when she was the Tauranga City Council Commissioner to try and ascertain what was being proposed and the rationale. What was interesting about my father's meeting with Anne Tolley is that she concluded that the roading lines drawn on the plan provided by the applicant at one of the Bulk Road residents' meetings had no more significance than if she or him had drawn the lines on the plan, indicating that there was still much work to be done before determining appropriate road corridors. She also agreed to have Andrew Mead, the council roading engineer, consider the other available alternatives further. This, however, went nowhere. The only time that council has initiated direct engagement with my father was following public notification of the plan change in March this year. Philip Martelli contacted my father in late June by phone and asked him to come and meet with him to discuss the proposed bulk road widening notation, which he did on 3 July. The proposed road widening on the eastern side was discussed with no resolution, and the meeting ended up with Philip asking my father if he would like to meet with their compensation team, which my father declined. My father phoned Philip after that meeting on 8 July to ask if an assessment of effects had been done on the road widening. And Philip advised my father that they were currently working on it. This seems highly unusual that this would be done at such a late stage and post-public notification of the proposed notation. The engagement or lack of it by council is not the process you would expect to be followed when such a material land take of private land is proposed. If my father had not made his own inquiries, he would have had no knowledge of the proposed road widening on his property until March this year, at the same time that it was notified to the public at large. To this end, my parents have been blindsided and have had very limited opportunity to prepare for this hearing, particularly given that the bulk road widening memorandum setting out the basis for rationale was only included in the Section 42A hearing report, publicly notified 3 weeks ago. We are also of the view that the roading assessment undertaken by Philip Martelli and annexed as Appendix 6 to the Section 42A hearing report has been reverse engineered to fit a remote design created by a roading engineer without in situ environmental assessment, and which should appear on the face of it to be primarily designed to ensure that 2 roundabouts line up. Assessment of effects and a robust analysis of alternative corridors should have been undertaken at the time of concept design, not after the event and at a late stage as part of a Section 42A hearing report. We are therefore of the view that the reasons for the road widening recommendation have been prepared after the event to support a remote concept design as opposed to a design formulated on the basis of proper planning and environmental considerations. Our third submission is that where private land is required for road widening, we understand that usual practice is to take land from both sides of the road, where land is available on both sides, which is the case here. The only exception to that rule would be where there is a physical impediment on one side of the road, for example, a cliff or a river, which is not the case here. Land is available on both the eastern and western sides of Bulk Road, and we cannot see any basis or rationale for taking land from one side of the road only and for not following the usual practice designed to ensure parity across private landowners. I will come to the natural watercourse, which has been cited as an impediment reason shortly. Our fourth submission is that there are a number of errors and omissions in the Bulk Road widening assessment memorandum contained in Appendix 6 to the hearing report, which I note have also been carried through into the Simpson-Gresser Memorandum of Council filed on behalf of Tauranga Council at 3:50 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, 1 working day prior to this hearing. The memorandum refers in a number of places to a natural watercourse present on the western side of Bulk Road, and that being a justified impediment to any road take on the western side. The watercourse is not, however, a naturally occurring watercourse at all, but rather roading drainage put in by Western Bay Council as part of a roading upgrade in the early 2000s. It sits in existing road reserve and is only 150 metres in length. It does not run the entire length of the Bulk Road Stage 4 area and is not a natural watercourse. Western Bay Council acquired land from Margaret Brazier for the drainage in the early 2000s. Where the drain is located, Bulk Road is 27 metres in width, not 20 metres as stated in the memorandum. The memorandum states that the number of private landowners on the eastern side is less than the western side, and therefore there are less private landowners on the eastern side to deal with. This is not correct. In fact, there are more private landowners on the eastern side than the western side, i.e. the reverse is true. There are 5 on the western side, treating the Bent property as 2 separate titles, and 6 individual landowners on the eastern side, treating, as with the Bent properties, my parents' land as 2 separate titles. The owners on the eastern side are Fisher, Cochrane, Gibson, Haven, Smythe and Smythe, 6 in total. It is our understanding that the Collier property, also on the eastern side, has been acquired by the applicant. If that is not correct, the number of private landowners on the eastern side increases to 7. 3 of the individual landowners on the eastern side, Cochrane, Gibson and Haven, appear to have been left out of the memorandum. However, these properties have driveways and services all falling within the proposed 18-metre strip. Whilst they are driveways and not dwellings, they are still relevant to analysis and are still private landowners that need to be dealt with. The Smythe land must also be treated as 2 independent lots in any analysis, as previously mentioned, the land was subdivided into 2 separate lots by my father, and one or both of these titles could be sold off independently of each other at any time. On the western side, where there are only 5 landowners to deal with, Margaret Brazier, Mark Brazier, George, Bent and Bent, there are no dwellings impacted like there are on the eastern side due to the setback of the western side dwellings from the road boundary. The memorandum states that one of the landowners on the eastern side, the Fishers, have already fenced and landscaped for the future road widening on the eastern side. I note that no evidence has been provided to support this. There is no supporting information on the location and measurements of the alleged preemptive landscaping. And at no time has direct notice of land acquisition been provided, giving them a formal and certain basis to take preemptive landscaping measures from. In any event, the activities of a neighbour are not relevant to support a road take assessment or analysis and do not constitute a valid planning consideration. The memorandum has, in respect to my parents' property, referenced the fact that a dwelling is involved. What it doesn't state is that the 18-metre take, comprising approximately half a hectare of land, cuts right through the middle of that dwelling. And in Appendix 5, we have included some aerial photographs depicting that. What it doesn't mention is that what it also doesn't mention is that it deletes another large building in its entirety and deletes drainage easements in place to ensure independence of lots 1 and 2 in subdivision value. Whilst we understand that until such time that the land is sold, any modifications or additions within the road take area results in consenting matters, the future implications on sale and value are significant, as this land cannot even be used for services, buildings, storage, etc. for future industrial development. It has no utility. The memorandum states throughout that the existing Belt Road corridor is 20 metres in width. This is incorrect. And in parts, Belt Road is in fact 27 metres wide. We suggest that more diligence and site investigation be undertaken by council and the applicant to ensure accuracy of information, particularly given the materiality of decisions being made on the basis of these facts. Our 5th submission is that we believe that the eastern side has inferior topography and land contour to the western side of the road, and that it is not practical and efficient planning for the road widening to be taken from the eastern side. I've previously referred to the fact that 1/3 of my parents' land is in a steep hillside that would need to be cut through. That hill is not present on the western side, and to cut through the bank may disturb the integrity of the hillside and also the valley below. It is also important to note that the hill does not stop at my parents' rear boundary. The balance of Belt Road on the eastern side continues at this elevated plane. Therefore, any road corridor provided to support future possible residential development in Upper Belt Road would need to address this for some length. we believe that the roading engineers that have recommended the road corridor location be on the eastern side have not undertaken robust site and land contour analysis. It is also our submission that the more sensible planning approach for any access to Upper Bulk Road, any future Upper Bulk Road residential development, would in fact be via Pies Pa. This would ensure that residents are not being routed through 2 kilometres of industrial estate to enter their residential area. This alternative access route, which would ensure access through a residential area instead, would also negate the health concerns that have come to light with having industrial area bordering residential. And I believe is one of the drivers for Tauranga Council looking to relocate industrial area away from the mount, where health detriment from industrial activity has been identified for the surrounding residential areas. This alternative route would not appear to have been considered by Tauranga Council as a suitable alternative, and I believe that this is an oversight. Even where cost is involved, the alternative must still be considered under the Resource Management Act. Lower Bulk Road also sits within a natural valley. This creates a natural and logical environmental separation between the industrial and proposed future residential area and would enable the industrial activity to be ring-fenced from the residential area. My father has raised this alternative option with Tauranga Council on 3 occasions, and at no time have they given it any consideration, citing that it would be far too costly, despite the obvious planning merit that it has. It is also our submission that there can be no certainty that the Upper Bulk Road residential development, which the road widening notation in the ODP future-proofs for, will go ahead. And this has been confirmed by the addresses of council today. Likely does not constitute certain nor guaranteed. The land currently sits within another council's jurisdiction, Western Bay of Plenty. Even if the land comes into Tauranga City's jurisdiction at some point in the future, and the land is rezoned from rural to residential, there can be no certainty that this will occur or occur within the next 30 years. To the extent that it does, 30 years, 3 decades from now is a long time in the future. And there is no guarantee how people will even travel and live in 30 years' time. And consequently, what type of roading corridors may or may not be required at that time. If the plan change works to current state as opposed to an uncertain future state, the only guarantee to the extent the plan change goes through is that an industrial road corridor will be required. An industrial road corridor only requires width of 27 metres. The existing bulk road corridor is 20 in width and increases to 27 metres along Margaret Brazier's boundary, where land was acquired for a road reserve in the early 2000s. Increasing bulk road to a 27 metre width would be a fairly straightforward and far less invasive process. It wouldn't disturb the roading drainage in the road reserve along Margaret Brazier's property, and the existing 20 metre width could be continued down the western side from the Brazier property. Taking 7 metres of roading along a limited strip on the western side would not disturb any dwellings and is therefore a far more sensible planning alternative to an 18-metre road take along 6 privately owned properties and the deletion of a large and established 5-bedroom dwelling, other significant buildings and subdivision easements. It is also our submission that the method being applied under the ODP to address future roading requirements is specifically designed to circumvent the protective legislation and the principle of reciprocity in place for private land takes under the Public Works Act and the RMA. The proposed method, a roading notation via an ODP, as opposed to a formal designation, creates uncertainty around future requirement and timing, and unjustifiably compromises and burdens the asset through a freezing of the land and the restrictive activity covenants that come with the notation. In my parents' case, the freezing order goes further than just restricting activity, but also deletes the functionality of shared service easements between lots and therefore erodes subdivision value. A road widening notation via an ODP creates a complexity for the incumbent owner, both while they hold the asset and on sale of the land, erodes the value of the asset with no compensation provided for that incumbent owner at the time of value loss, and makes it impossible for a valuation analysis based on square metre area and developable area to be run with certainty on sale of the land. It creates a scenario where the incumbent owner suffers the loss on value, but the incoming owner, in this context, a future industrial developer, receives the benefit of the incumbent's value loss, but then also receives the benefit of compensation provided at the time when future designation and acquisition is made. Noting also that at this point, fair market value for the land, being the test under the Public Works Act, is determined on the basis of developed industrial land, constituting another layer of value benefit for the incoming developer. This is a structure carefully designed to avoid having to neutralise the incumbent landowner and to enable a double dipping of value by a future developer of the land who has purchased the land on the basis of a value discount for the quarantined land. Noting that valuation practice is for a developer acquiring the land to value the quarantined roading land at zero due to the lack of utility and restriction that it has. This has already been foreshadowed for my parents in the unsolicited offer that they received a year and a half ago, which deleted the proposed road take from the developable area and valuation calculations, but provided no compensation for that area of land, an area where the future developer would then be compensated for when that land was acquired or designated in the future. I would also argue that the notation mechanism effectively kicks the can down the road for council by enabling land to be set aside now, but conveniently defers the payment obligation to some time in the future. In practice, it is therefore designed to create financial and economic efficiency for council. The RMA and the Public Works Act is in place to ensure the protection of the interests of an equitable and reciprocal treatment for private landowners to avoid value erosion and uncertainty for that private landowner. The underlying premise being that it is the incumbent private landowner losing their land that should be neutralised and have access to available relief. I would argue that the method being applied through this private plan change breaches the spirit and intent of both the PWA and the Resource Management Act. The protective compensatory framework under this legislation is there for good reason, and it becomes even more pertinent where dwellings, buildings, loss of business premises, and home relocation and consultant costs are involved, as the Commissioner will be aware. The only scenario where a private landowner could, under this proposed structure, receive the benefit of compensation for the quarantined land is where the incumbent landowner is in a position to hold the asset until such time in the future when the acquisition is required. In this case, potentially 30 years from now, and even that is uncertain given the land is currently in another council's jurisdiction. Where you have a rural landowner being displaced from their land due to encroachment of surrounding industrial development and activity, which I note is not just caused through the resultant environmental disturbance, but also the risk of serious health and safety detriment caused when one lives amongst industrial activity. The decision to sell and exit the environment becomes a Hobson's choice, where there is no reasonable and safe alternative but to exit the environment. In practical terms, it is therefore not a realistic option in this scenario for the incumbent owner to retain the land. I now need to raise a matter of a more personal nature, which makes the rezoning, the proposed road widening notation on my parents' land, and the lack of due care and process followed to date seriously unjust. The reason why my father, who has spent years appearing at these sorts of hearings for the benefit of the Belk Road residents and is well capable of doing so, cannot be here representing himself today is because he is not well enough to be. He's not well enough to even be present at this hearing. My father is terminally ill, and he is a very, very unwell man. My father has late-stage mesothelioma. For those that don't know what mesothelioma is, it is a very unpleasant and painful form of lung cancer caused from exposure to asbestos. It is terminal and uncurable. Treatment is palliative only. My father has been fighting this terrible disease since 2020, in parallel to this matter. Treatment has failed, as has the lung catheter that has been used to drain 4 litres of fluid off his lung every week. He is a man that is currently struggling to just be able to breathe. A proud and a good man that can no longer walk to his letterbox or be at a hearing discussing the fate of his only asset. He is a dying man. The mental and emotional strain that the worry around this plan change and the way that it potentially impacts his property of the last 48 years and the future ease, security and provision that he can provide for the wife and the family that he would leave behind has been immense and very, very difficult to observe. Every conversation I have with my father is unfairly focused on this matter and ends with him saying to me, I just do not need this strain. Imagine being in his shoes just for 1 minute. You're mentally and emotionally trying to reconcile dying and leaving your loved ones behind. You're in excruciating amounts of pain. You can't sleep. Your days are comprised of difficult medical appointments and tests. You're trying to get your affairs in order. You're trying to ensure that the widow you leave behind in her mid-70s and therefore beyond her working years will be okay and have financial security. Struggling to just breathe. You're riddled with the fear and anxiety of how much longer you will have. And on top of all of that, and the obvious injustice of having mesothelioma from exposure to asbestos, is you have the stress of a potential and uncertain land acquisition, which cuts through the middle of your home, complicates a sale of your only asset, reduces the value of your asset, but proposes to compensate the future landowner who receives the benefit of this value loss on purchase of the land, and leaves your widow at the hardest time of her life, navigating a very complex situation as stopping her ability to realise the asset and estate with ease and value preserved, and therefore her ability to relocate into a new home which she can comfortably manage on her own in a timely manner. The injustice of this is immense and wholly inequitable. My father has not wanted to raise the matter of his health to date, as he hasn't wanted to be perceived as a vulnerable person, and that be used as leverage against him in respect of this matter. But he is vulnerable. In fact, he is the most vulnerable any person could possibly be, and that is relevant. My father does not have the capacity to fight this, as he needs all the fight he has in him right now to just stay alive. He has not even had the capacity to prepare for this hearing. I've had to step in and pick it up for him 2.5 weeks ago, and I'm not based in Tauriko. 2.5 weeks versus 4 years of preparation, which the applicant and Tauriko Council has had the benefit of, and presumably longer, is quite some time in balance, as I'm sure the Commissioner can appreciate. My mother is currently a full-time carer to my father, grieving and heartbroken, watching the pain, anguish and discomfort of her husband and life partner of 54 years, and living on top of all of this fear and anxiety around her future, with the added anxiety of knowing that she will lose my father, and in parallel, lose the home that they created and shared together for the last 48 years, and have to watch a bulldozer go through his legacy. But on top of that, to then have anguish over your ability to sell and realise your only asset free of complexity and legal battles, and your ability to move to a new home that you can manage on your own. It is traumatic and unfair, to say the very least. Two of the greatest stresses in life are a death and losing your home. And my mother is enduring both of these greatest stresses in parallel because of this plan change and matter. Circumstances wholly unrelated to her. I am putting the applicant and Tauranga Council on notice today of my father's and parents' circumstances. It is imperative that the parties involved in this matter proceed with the utmost due care, regard and compassion. It is simply cruel that they are having to deal with the stress of this matter during the hardest time of their lives, and when they have simply no capacity to do so. My parents and the family, for obvious reasons, are not in the position to hold this asset for the next 30 years until when there may or may not be a formal designation and acquisition of the land, making relief and compensation available. My mother needs to be able to realise the asset free of complexity and in a way that doesn't force her to suffer value loss due to the uncertainty, heavy restrictions and burden created by eroding notation. To place a balance sheet objective of a private developer and future growth agenda of a local council ahead of the civil liberties and humane treatment of a dying man and his future widow in her 70s and private landowners of 48 years would be an indefensible injustice and erosion of legal ownership rights and steamrolling of a private landowner at its very worst. The protections, equity, recourse and relief provided under the Resource Management Act and the Public Works Act are there to ensure the protection of private landowners, and that stealth acquisitions, which create uncertainty and don't neutralise value loss for a landowner at the time the value loss is suffered and unfairly burden and fetter a person's asset, are not made. The council and the applicant are not above the law and should not be granted superior status at the expense of a private landowner. The method proposed by the applicant and council in the ODP is purporting to do exactly that. In summary, it is our submission that the plan change 35 be made without a road widening notation, and that this is looked at in more detail in the future when the road widening is actually required, with formal designation at that time and a robust Section 32 analysis and public planning process undertaken, which looks at all available alternatives, and when council is in a position to compensate and neutralise the affected landowners at the time of value loss. And I'd just like to take the opportunity, if I can, to invite the Commissioner to visit my parents' property, if he would like to do that at any time. And we can certainly accommodate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Just in terms of that last offer, I did a site visit yesterday, which included viewing your parents' property from above and also from the roadside. So, yeah, familiar with its location.
Thank you.
And just in terms of the issues you've raised about your father, without wanting to belittle those, just acknowledge them and sympathise with you. I'm sure many in the room have lost family members to illness, and so do understand what you and your parents are going through, and just want to acknowledge that. But now I do have some questions of a more, I guess, pragmatic or planning nature. So do you want a couple minutes break, or are you?
Oh, I'm okay. Thank you.
So just let me find. Yeah, just before I ask you these questions, do you have available to you either in hard copy or from this, I'm going to mispronounce your name every time I go to say it. Do you have a copy of Appendix 6 from the Section 42A report?
Got a soft copy of it.
Yeah, either. I just want you to be able to show Ms. Smythe the map that's attached on page 4 of Appendix 6 to the 42A report. No, not that appendix, the 42A report appendix.
I can see that.
Yep, so that's a map that has lines on it in blue and pink showing different properties.
That's correct.
Now, I just want to take you to your page 5. And middle of paragraph B, where you identify that there might be 6 owners on the eastern side.
Yep.
So on that map, Fisher is indicated.
Correct.
And Smythe and Smythe. Is it Smythe or Smith? How do you?
Smythe.
Smythe.
Yep.
Smythe and Smythe. So Cochrane, Gibson and Haven, where are they?
They have rights of way, so they sit behind my parents' property, but access to their properties is through driveways, which are stacked on the, what boundary would you call that? On the northern boundary of my parents' property, and those driveways are not depicted on this plan.
Oh, I see them now. So yeah.
So if you're taking an 18-metre strip down the eastern side, in terms of the private landowners' land that you cut through, it's Fisher's, the right-of-ways serving those 3 back properties. Now, that's under the understanding that the Collier property, which is actually shown as being still privately owned, but our understanding is that has been acquired by the applicant.
Okay.
So those 3 back properties are accessed from driveways, which is next to my parents' property. So it would cut across their driveways and the services contained within that land.
So looking at that same diagram and now turning over to your page 6 and paragraph E, just above paragraph 5.
Yes.
Parts of Belt Road are 27 metres wide. So on that diagram, where would those parts be?
So if you can see it's depicted here as being called brazier PV.
Yep.
And then also, what I would need to actually defer to is the plan in the ODP, which actually shows the location of that drainage, and it's where that drain is located that the road is 27 metres in width, because that drainage was put into roading reserve. So if we can bring that up, then I can tell you if it runs along both the brazier properties or just that top brazier property. So if we just reconcile that.
So I've got the ODP up on my screen. Do you have it on your little screen there? So I can see just near the bottom of the ODP, there's a slightly wider section of road. Is that's adjacent to a dotted line, which is the drain? Is that the 27?
The dotted line is the drain, and that's what I believe has been referred to as the natural watercourse.
Yep, but is the 27 metre width that slightly
actually,
wider?
in fact, you can see if you zoom in, you can see that the road actually steps in. Yes,
yep. So that's what you're referring to.
Correct.
There. Okay, right. Now, I just want to ask you about the point you're making in your paragraph 7 on page 7.
Yes.
So the private plan change before me as a decision maker relates to the industrial development of stage 4. And it would seem to me that if a wider road is required to enable that industrial development, then that sits squarely within the decision that I need to make, because it's part and parcel of the private plan change.
Correct. Yes.
And as you've identified there, and I think it's elsewhere in the evidence, that in terms of the industrial development on its own, we're looking at a 27 metre width.
That's my understanding.
To enable the Upper Belt Road urban development growth area, we're looking at the 38 metres.
My understanding.
So from what you're saying in paragraph 7, if I was to reach a conclusion that in terms of enabling the industrial development of stage 4, a 27 metre road width is required, and if that was to be included on an ODP, to what extent would that satisfy the concerns that you're bringing in front of me this morning?
We would still have concerns around the method being used to set aside the road land, for the reasons that I've outlined in paragraph 8 of our submissions. And just to respond on that further, it would also be a question if there was a 7 metre road take, if that was to be split across both sides of the road evenly, or if it were to be placed on just the eastern side, because that becomes relevant also in terms of materiality versus immateriality.
And that. That's the only things I wanted to put to you, and that's because your material prepared is very clear and very well put. So no further questions or clarification from me.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Appreciate that.
Thank you. So at this stage, I now hear from the Section 42A reporting team. So I imagine you're going to want a small break to consider the matters that have been put before me by the last submitter, and I'd encourage you to take a small break to do that. And particularly in terms of your presentation to me, I'm very interested in getting some more definitive understanding of the likely timing of the Upper Belt Road urban growth area. When within the 30-year time horizon is that likely to proceed? And the second question is, just who would be the proponent of that? Any kind of plan change or whatever required to enable that? Would that be the council as the proponent? And if it is the council as the proponent, would the council at that stage be able to designate the necessary road widening to enable that Upper Belt Road urban growth area to go ahead? And then, Ms. Ham, just when you give your reply, what I'm particularly interested in from the applicant or the proponent's perspective is just to confirm what widths of road widening is required on Belt Road to enable the industrial development of stage 4, which is the actual proposal before me. And just, I noted in your legal submissions that you put the road widening notation on the ODP squarely in the City Council's camp to respond to. But I'd be very interested in the proponent's view on an ODP notation that showed an indicative 27-metre wide road width to enable industrial development, with the precise location of that versus either side of the road to be confirmed, I guess, at time of subdivision. These are just thoughts that I'm having at the moment, but I'd appreciate your view on that. All right, so now we're going to take a small break. I'm proposing, say, 10 minutes. So does the 42A team need any longer than that? Would you like more than that? 10 minutes is great. All right, so let's say we'll come back at 11:35. All right, now we're going to resume the hearing, and at this stage I'm hearing from the Tauranga City Council Section 42A reporting team.
Thank you for that. Since the issue of the Belt Road widening is fresh in everyone's minds, we will turn to address that first. And I guess I'll be supported by Andy Mead from Tauranga City Council in response to that. So Andy presented evidence which was also being tabled for the purpose of the hearing. So our council's position is that we still are of the opinion that the notation on the outline development plan is the most appropriate tool at this time available to provide a level of certainty to council and also future development of the properties around the need for additional road widening to service Upper Belt Road. The Commissioner has asked questions as to whether or not there's alternative options available and specifically asked whether or not a building notation or a building setback would be a more appropriate outcome. My rebuttal evidence has addressed this in some degree and suggested that those are perhaps more blunt tools than the outline development plan notation, which may provide a little bit more flexibility in this outcome as well too. So just turning to, I'll just turn to hand over to Andy Mead now, and he's going to address the questions you raised, Commissioner, about the timing of Upper Belt Road, and if it was, if the road widening was required and the acquisition of land was required, what that process may look like as well.
Thank you. I'll just introduce myself again. So my name is Andrew Mead. I'm the Manager of City Planning and Growth at Tauranga City Council. And as mentioned in that introduction, I did provide some strategic evidence which covered off a range of these matters. So just on the time frame issue, in terms of when would the Upper Belt Road area likely be developed, and I will acknowledge that, yes, there is some uncertainty about that. There is uncertainty about all these types of future, I guess, development projects as they have significant planning processes to move through. And those processes are never simple or easy. But based on our future development strategy, which has just recently been adopted as part of the Smart Growth Strategy 2024 update, there are significant shortages of industrial and residential development capacity. The industrial issues present themselves in the long term, so roughly in the 10-year period and beyond. The residential development capacity issues are present now with shortages of over 5,000 homes across the Tauranga and broader Western Bay of Plenty sub-region. We are in the process of developing an implementation plan to give effect to the future development strategy and the broader smart growth strategy. That implementation plan will be workshopped based on the current timeframes at the September meeting of the Smart Growth Committee, and will be confirmed in the October meeting, subject to any changes to that. The draft implementation plan is not public at this stage, but will become public in September. At the moment, and I can provide the wording of this separately, there is an action in the draft implementation plan to undertake the structure planning, including the consideration of the boundary arrangements between the two councils in the short-term period, so that's the 1 to 3 year planning period. And the responsibility of that action is somewhat uncertain at this stage, and that is because Kāinga Ora and its urban development capacity are working through and have made recommendations to the Minister around the potential establishment of a specified development project under the urban development legislation. So I guess what we are until we get ministerial decision making, we're not sure whether that action will progress through an SDP process or through a more standard structure planning and plan change process under the Resource Management Act. What we anticipate through the structure planning process is that we would move then on to the rezoning of that, and then the delivery of enabling infrastructure. Those are processes that take significant amount of time. A significant amount of infrastructure would need to be built at a significant cost, with funding constraints and funding options still to be established. So I guess my view, based on where we are at the moment and the need for growth in this area, is that we could see growth commencing in the early part of the 10 to 30 year period, with infrastructure development potentially preceding that in the later part of the next 10 years. I guess based on what we've heard today, it's a question about whether we are protecting, I guess, a narrower corridor, or that full 38-metre wide corridor required for future access and development of that Upper Belt Road area. I guess if we are, unsuccessful in being able to protect that corridor through this process, which we would like to do, we will have to consider those other, mechanisms and planning options to do that, which we would do, including, designation or acquisition processes under the Public Works Act. We're obviously committed as a council to ensuring that fair compensation is paid, and we don't anticipate any other outcome than that occurring in the future. So I'd just also like to mention that with respect to some of the properties to the north along Belk Road that are in stage 4, which are owned by the proponent of the private plan change, we've already come to agreement around the acquisition of the corridor on the eastern side of the road to the full 38 metres in width, and those areas have been separately subdivided off, as I understand. And we are working through a process at the moment to formalise that agreement through a developer agreement, and we have funding in the long-term plan to complete that acquisition within the next 10 years and the earlier part of the next 10-year process. So I'll just leave those comments there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. So just to clarify, so the process in terms of the Upper Belk Road urban growth area would be confirmation of timings, etc., and funding in October 2024 in terms of smart growth. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And then following that, there would be a structure planning process. And then did you say then rezoning, then provision of infrastructure? Or
yeah, that's correct.
And so just remind me of the likely timeframes for that. So if now we're year 0, going out to year 10, when would the structure plan likely be developed?
Yeah, so the structure planning process is identified to happen in the next 3 years. So that work to be happened and completed within the next 3 years. Then leading on, I guess, to the notification of the plan change soon after.
So within the next 3 years, structure planning, then rezoning, and it will have to follow its Schedule 1 process, which may take several years if it's opposed. And then once that's confirmed, infrastructure provision subject to funding.
Yeah, that is correct. And within that, we have to resolve the issues around the boundary between the two councils and whether that land would transfer to the city or not, as this land that we're talking about today previously has. So it'd be a similar process led by the local government commission if that were to occur.
Right. So where in that process would that occur? Would that occur after the rezoning or before the rezoning?
It would be problematic for it to occur after the rezoning because we want it to be incorporated into the Tauriko City Plan. So just like we've done for this area, for Tauriko West and other areas, if there was a boundary adjustment to occur, it would happen before we notified rezoning.
Now, do you have available to you the map that's in Mr. Martelli's Appendix 6 to the 42A report that I was asking the submitter about?
I don't have it in front of me right at the moment.
Someone can give it to you, I'm sure.
Yes, I do.
Yep, so just in terms of where you've already negotiated 38-metre width with the proponent, so looking at that diagram, which property, and you looking at the numbers within each property, which properties are those?
I'll let Sean correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand it's numbers 111, 127 and 163. Is that correct? Sorry. And also number 76.
And so just from the proponents, so the Fisher property on that picture, 157, that's still privately owned? Maybe Ms. Hammond, in terms of when you address me, you can indicate the proponents' proposals regarding the Fisher property, whether that's to be purchased or not purchased. So, Mr. Mead, just in terms of that, the subdivision and purchasing for the 38-metre width that we just discussed, so that's all on the eastern side, is it?
Yes, aside from on number 76.
Yeah. All right. Okay, no, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one more matter in relation to this issue. Commissioner, you asked the question around the 27-metre footprint for Belt Road as well. So just for clarification's sake, the 27 metres is specified as an indicative likely corridor width for Belt Road. But as you would have seen from our evidence, council's preference is to confirm the road cross-section profile through the infrastructure development code and the street design toolkit at the time of actual development. And particularly when there's certainty around what is happening in that space. And when I talk about certainty, I talk about things like the scale of development, how many accesses onto Belt Road are provided in that space. And so it's not, what I'd like to articulate is we've earmarked 27 as what we think is expected, but there could be changes depending on specific outcomes there too. Right, I'm going to turn back to the main body of the Section 42A report and specifically address now the supplementary evidence that Mr. Grace has tabled and also the supplementary evidence that Ms. Holden has also tabled today as well too. Don't intend to reiterate any of the points in the 42A report or the 42A rebuttal that has been presented, other than to just record that the number of submissions, that there was 13 and 5 further submissions. And as we're aware, the Bent's submission has been withdrawn. You'll note that there's a lot of commentary in this 42A report that's now superfluous as a result of the Bent submission being withdrawn. And similarly, Appendix 1 of that 42A report has a number of annotations and clauses around accept or reject in relation to their submissions that if the Commissioner wishes, I can tidy up in due course as well.
No, I can do that. That's fine.
So as you have heard today, since the provision of the 42A report, there has been some further dialogue and engagement with the applicant's planner and the regional council to clarify the provisions. So I think probably the best way to address this moving forward is if we open up attachment 2 of Mr. Grace's evidence. And I think let's just step through each of the points and the matters. So starting with the chapter 4, the noise provisions. So Mr. Grace identified that he had inadvertently removed some language, which I have put back into that provision, and I have also inadvertently removed some language around the reference to a rural or rural residential property. And so my evidence is that it should refer to rural or rural residential property there. So now coming down to policy 12E 1.31, and perhaps for the sake of this conversation, we call it the policy, since we've only got one policy we're dealing with. There has been quite a lot of evidence and discussion and I guess debate on clause A2 and the appropriateness of the terminology integrate and interface with natural freshwater receiving environments. So it's my opinion that integrate and interface are an appropriate mechanism to be used, an appropriate language to be used in this policy. I've set out in my section 42A rebuttal my interpretation of the word interface if I was a consents planner processing an application for a subdivision consent. If, however, the Commissioner was of the opinion that he didn't agree with that wording, then I have concerns with the wording you have proposed, and that it seems to cut into, I guess, policy 6 and 7 of the NPS FW, more so than policy 3, which is around the integration, and wonder whether or not it should actually be minimise the degradation and loss of natural fresh water and not the actual reference of natural rivers and wetlands as well. So you'll see that policy 3 clearly identifies that it's freshwater and the integration there. I guess the key point here, and if I go back to the reasons for preferring our wording, is that we're still going to end up in a situation where we have a policy framework in the city plan that really cuts across regional council requirements too. And so what we'll find is that there will be this policy, but yet when you end up going into the policy framework of the regional plan, there's a whole lot of other exceptions that will need to be considered in relation to this issue. And those are best addressed through those regional council consents. So just to clarify, if the Commissioner was of the opinion to prefer his wording over mine, then I would recommend that it reads, where practicable, integrate with and minimise the degradation and loss of natural freshwater. The Commissioner asked a question of Mr. Grace about the riparian protection along the Omainawa stream and whether or not it was specified anywhere about the 5 metre. Draw your attention to clause C of that, the subdivision provisions, that's the 12E3(1)(10). This subdivision provision says that the applicant needs to demonstrate how the provisions of cultural heritage plan are given effect to, including riparian protection. And you'll note there at clause 3, it talks about the Omainawa stream and stormwater ponds. When we go back down to the appendix cross-section, there would be an opportunity, however, to be more specific in a notation on that cross-section around the width being 5 metres. So as we work, I'll take us through to that cross-section in the end and draw your attention to where I think that might be appropriate. We've heard a lot today around the stormwater management plan and what it applies to and what it doesn't apply to. And also in the rebuttal evidence of Mr. Grace, he proffered or proposed an additional clause to the subdivision requirement around the provision of a stormwater management plan if one was not available, or if this comprehensive stormwater consent was not in place. Now, in his wording, you'll see at that point Q, he's talked about in the end of the second line, before any subdivision or change of land use. So the first thing I'd like to bring to the Commissioner's attention is that this rule is for subdivision. It's not for a change of land use. So this is an information requirement purely for subdivision. And secondly, it really just cross-references the requirements in 2 clauses above in that same rule, so N and P. So for those reasons, and taking a pragmatic approach, my suggestion is that instead of having this new clause for the stormwater management plan, that we actually have a clause back in N, which wraps up this matter as well. So in that context, as agreed with the Regional Council, the current first requirement of N is how the requirements of a relevant approved stormwater consent and the relevant stormwater management plan will be achieved. My suggestion is that prior to that clause, we have, for lots not already subject to a stormwater management plan or approved stormwater consent, the provision of a stormwater management plan. So I'll repeat that in a minute. And the reason for that is clause N is the provision of a stormwater engineering assessment. So it's a given that any subdivision within stage 4 has to already provide that stormwater engineering assessment. In my opinion, there's no need to duplicate another clause in this rule that requires that stormwater management plan. So I guess if we look at it as a cascading perspective, if we redraft I to as I've proposed, then the first point that you look at is, do you have a stormwater management plan or an approved consent? And if you don't, you provide a stormwater management plan. And then the second clause would be how the requirements of that relevant approved stormwater consent and relevant stormwater management plan will be achieved. And then going into the other cursory matters thereafter. Anyone like me to read that wording out again?
Yeah, read it slowly.
Sorry. For lots not already subject to a stormwater management plan or approved stormwater consent, the provision of a stormwater management plan. Yeah, I'll move on for that. So,
Sorry, just before you do.
yeah,
So that's additional to the clause I currently in Mr. Grace's attachment two, or is that?
no, that would
That's a
be,
rewording of that.
that would
Roman's
be,
I.
that would supersede that clause. Yeah, so clause Q would fall away.
I understand that, but now we're looking at N, Romans I. So what you just read out, is that additional to Romans I that's there in green font, or is
Yes,
it?
yes, correct. So you push I down.
Okay, so it's
Yep.
additional, not a
Yeah, correct.
rewording of I.
Yep.
Yep, that's good.
Yep.
Okay, thanks, carry on.
The next matter is still in that same area. So clause 2, as per Mr. Grace's evidence, is around low impact design principles. As we've heard today, the Bay of Plenty Regional Council's preference is that there is additional wording added to the end of that clause to specifically address the treatment of stormwater from what they consider to be high use roads, so more than 5,000 vehicle movements per day. So the Commissioner, you asked the question around whether or not the city plan uses that 500 vehicle movement threshold at present, which it does not. And as part of the preparation for this hearing, I've had dialogue with other planners who are processing the various other plan changes that are happening with TCC at present, including Tauriko West. For a similar request from the regional council has been made for Tauriko West, and the agreement that they've reached with, well, the agreement that's going to be proffered there is that they've actually defined what the road is. So, and on that structure plan, they've got various roads defined, and so the provision actually directly refers to that road. But it just talks about it being treated. There's no reference to 5,000, and it's also states that it's relevant to the stormwater consent. It meets the requirements of the relevant stormwater consent. And I guess the point of difference between the two plan changes is that Tauriko West is going through the comprehensive stormwater discharge consent concurrently to the plan change process. So that's an outcome which is well defined and certain too. Whereas, as we've heard today, there's the comprehensive stormwater discharge consent for a portion of the plan change area follows. So turning back to whether or not it's appropriate to include that provision, it comes, in my mind, it comes back to a couple of matters. So the first is, are we already satisfied that there is requirements for treating in that framework without specifying that it, specifically high use roads that we need to be treating? And secondly, if it's not included here, how else would it get picked up? And what you've heard and what you've seen in our evidence is that council has their infrastructure development code, and it has specific requirements around stormwater management. So, in my opinion, this information requirement at the time of subdivision, which it is, talks specifically about treatment already. And that will then lead into future engineering design being subject to the infrastructure development code as well. So in my opinion, it's not the specificity that the regional council is requesting is not required. Right, so as we keep flicking through this subdivision information requirement and down to point Q. So point Q is the matter that relates to the central drain, and the only point here is that the regional council has requested that there's an additional reference to can be planted with native species. Let's go there. Yeah, so it would read that it can be planted in natives and maintained in perpetuity too. So in my opinion, I've got no concerns with the introduction of the word native in that space. So we'll move on to a different provision, so the controlled activity matters. So we've got 12E 3.26 and clause E here. So what we've heard today and what we've read is there's a difference of opinion between the proponents, planner, and also the regional council on whether or not the reference to ecological value should be included in that clause E. In my opinion, it should be included in clause E. And the reason for that is that whilst F is relating to the provision of identification of ecological values is required through a rule requirement above that requires an ecological assessment to be submitted. It is the core function of, sorry, I'll start that again. It will be imperative as part of council's assessment of the outcome that's been proposed for the central drain to ensure that it also looks at its ecological values, perhaps separate to any, assessment of ecological values from the ecological report, which is for the wider site.
Yeah, so just in terms of that was what where I was getting to in my own mind. E is specific to the drain, whereas F is ecological values generally, which can include other terrestrial ecological values if any exist.
That's correct. That's where I've got to. Okay, so now we turn to Appendix 18D. So the evidence of Mr. Grace has helpfully set out the difference or the form and function of that native exotic canopy tree planting. And Commissioner, I draw your attention to the landscape and visual assessment that was submitted in support of the application, which actually specifically includes reference to that space for the purpose of being a visual buffer as well too. So I think that point has potentially been missed by myself to this date. So I concur with Mr. Grace that the reference to just native canopy tree planting is not required, and that it should be retained as native and exotic. There is a typo in canopy that needs to be fixed up, but that's a future problem. And this is also probably the most appropriate place to have the notation for the 5 metres as well, this plan, sorry. So you'll see that under the box in red that I had drafted, there is a notation for a walkway, and then there's a notation for native riparian planting, and then there is the Omainawa stream. So in my opinion, it would be appropriate to impose a width requirement statement in that annotation to that plan. Thank you. I think that's the main points that I wanted to bring to the Commissioner's attention today.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. Just got a couple of questions. First of all, in terms of 12E.1.3.1 bracket A bracket Romans 2, so the policy and the debate over that clause Romans 2. Just in terms of your suggested wording in relation to the suggestion I put to the hearing, which was rivers and wetlands, and your suggestion of natural fresh water. So in terms of that, the only additional fresh water that would be captured by the use of the words natural fresh water would be groundwater, because otherwise, if it's surface water, it's either going to be in a river, which includes a stream, or in a wetland. And if it's in an artificial watercourse, then it's not a natural river, is it? It's an artificial watercourse, so that's not captured.
No, that's a very good point. And my mind had immediately started to turn to the central drain as we were talking about this matter. And you would have seen in the Section 42A report, the status of the central drain has been already sort of, I guess, debated in terms of an RMA sense as to you know, what its classification actually is. So perhaps natural fresh, perhaps the term natural is not appropriate.
All right.
But I think if we come to the purpose is we want to ensure that what is happening adjacent to these features is fit for purpose. Right, and we've done that to some degree by providing for the protection of the central drain in the future. If we're talking about the features on the known features on the site, there's not really any other features on this plan change site that are likely to require significant integration with.
So it's only the central drain, is that what you're saying?
And based on the information I have available to me ecologically at this point, that's my.
So we could just use the word central drain then, couldn't we?
Yes, we could. However, I caution that approach on the basis that this is, as I alluded to, a policy framework that is also subject, the City Council is rolling out on a variety of plan changes at present as well too. And so yes, it could be fit for purpose for this plan change, but it's ensuring that it's I guess fit for purpose, or there's a significant point of difference that we can differentiate it from.
Yeah, but the council wouldn't be lazy enough to just roll over inappropriate wording into other parts of the plan, would it? Rhetorical question.
Yep.
All right.
in my opinion, I think there has been significant consideration of ensuring that the policy framework is fit for purpose based on council's role in relation to integrative management under the NPSFM.
All right, so now just a question about 12E.3.1.10, the rule, and this issue of the high-use roads. So what would be your response to a suggestion, and have you got regional council's relief sort in front of you?
Yes.
Yep. To just include the words, including for all high-use roads without including the more specific 5,000 vehicle movements per day that's in brackets.
I would have a concern about that from a consent planner's perspective, because I wouldn't be able, as a consent planner, I wouldn't be able to define what a high-use road is. So the threshold is required to understand the terminology, because nowhere in the plan would a high-use road be defined.
How does the city plan define high-use roads?
I will need to look at that matter and come back to you. I'm not familiar with it. I don't, my thought process is that it probably doesn't have a specific definition for it. When we're talking about high-use roads in the context of this subdivision, this plan change, it's important to also be cognizant of the fact that we're talking about Belk Road. We're not talking about any likely other roads within the development.
Right, so we could just refer to Belk Road, couldn't we?
Could just refer to Belk Road.
Yeah, it might seem it's a simple solution. I'm all in favour of provisions that are specific to the actual geographic area that's being addressed in terms of, say, our early discussion about the central drain and now this discussion of Belk Road. All right, that's helpful. Just a query regarding the amendment to insert the word natives into clause Q, Romans 1 of that rule. Some councils I work for don't like using the word natives. They prefer the wording indigenous plant species as being more politically correct rather than the word natives.
That's an interesting point. To be fair, I flip-flopped on this provision as to whether or not it would be, the level of specificity would be required. And I got to the point, well, you're more likely than not to plant natives in that space, hence why I recommended that the change was appropriate. I'm
not concerned, sorry to interrupt. I'm not concerned with the principle, it's just the terminology natives versus indigenous plant species. It's just the wording.
It's a good point. If I could come back to you on that matter and just have a look at the TCC plan and see what they use in terms of their language to ensure consistency.
Okay, no, that's all the questions I had. Thank you. Now, does anyone else from your team wish to speak at this stage? Nope, shaking of heads.
I don't think other than was there anything, Mr. Fisher, that you wanted to bring to the Commissioner's attention?
Yeah, good afternoon to the Commissioner and the parties.
Mr. Fisher, we can't hear you, so you need to push a button on your computer. Someone needs to.
It's saying I'm unmuted. You still can't hear me?
Yes, we can now. Thank you.
Oh, you can? Oh, okay.
Yep.
All I said was good afternoon to the Commissioner and the parties, so you didn't miss much. So I have filed a memorandum in advance, which I know everyone has seen and read, and I know the Commissioner doesn't want to hear people reading things out. So I'll just briefly touch on a few points, and then we can go to questions. There were two issues addressed in the memorandum. The first one was the further submission by Winstone wallboards. And I think given the indication from the Commissioner at the beginning of the hearing, I don't need to perhaps dwell on that too much, if at all. I think the short point is that there's a few different ways of getting there, but basically there's no jurisdiction for that further submission, whether it's because it relied on a primary submission, it goes beyond the scope of the further submission, or it's beyond the scope of the plan change. It all takes us to the same place. And then there's of course the merits issue, which the Commissioner touched on. So I think we can move on from that. And the other issue addressed in my memorandum is, of course, the issue of the notation for the widening of Belt Road. And we've heard a fair bit about that today. And what I do want to say is I just want to preface these submissions that it's not my role here to tell the Commissioner how to exercise planning judgment. That's for the Commissioner. It's not my role as legal counsel for the council to wade into that. So you'll see I've deliberately tried to stay clear of that. Instead, what I've endeavoured to do is to put this whole issue into a statutory context that provides a bit of guidance and puts the relevant concerns into the relevant statutory parameters as the idea with these this advice or these submissions, however you want to call it. So in the submissions from paragraph 18, I've set out the background, how the proposed rule framework applies, and the SMICE submission. In paragraph 21, I've summarised the Section 42A report authors' reasons for supporting the retention of the notation. And I know some issues were raised with the factual nature of that. All this is doing is summarising the concerns in the Section 42A report. I'm not a planner. I don't give evidence on that, so it just reflects what was in those reports. Nothing more than that, and it is clear from paragraph 21. And the same goes for Appendix 6, of course, and attached to the Section 42A report. I've set out in 23 the relevant statutory considerations, which will be well known to the Commissioner, including Section 32. And then I get on to the sub-regional strategic planning context, and in particular, smart growth. And you've heard from Mr. Mead on that. You've read his evidence, and you've heard from a bit further, which provided a bit more clarity about how the progress that's been made on advancing urban growth area for Upper Belt Road, and how imminent those planning processes are with the draft FDS and so on. And then I go on to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, and I don't want to read that out either, except to note that I've pointed out some relevant objectives and policies which need to be given effect to, and they're fairly broad in their terms. It's things like achieving a well-functioning urban environment, good accessibility, integration between infrastructure planning and funding decisions, but being strategic over the medium and long term. And these are all things that are relevant to future-proofing a road and corridor through a notation in the plan. But I leave that for the Commissioner to take a closer look at those and form his own opinion on it. And down at paragraph 33 is where I really get into the concerns raised by the SMICE there, and just step through and respond to some of the things that have been raised and put them in a statutory context. The evidence, these submissions respond to the evidence of Ms. Hugaveen. Of course, we didn't, at the time they were written, we didn't have the evidence of Ms. Smythe. There doesn't seem to be any suggestion that it's unlawful to have a notation like this. Rather, the debate's about whether or not it's appropriate. And of course, the Commissioner did point out that provisions in ODPs like this are fairly common around the country. Ms. Hoogervin refers to the proposed notation as a designation by stealth, quarantining private land and sterilising the land. However, in reality, the proposed approach is a simple ODP notation with consenting implications should an applicant propose land use or subdivision that does not comply with or is inconsistent with the ODP. In the following paragraph, I talk about the greater flexibility potentially offered by a consenting process compared to a designation. It's not a yes or no, it's a broader evaluation than that, so potentially some advantages there. From paragraphs 38 to 41, I set out some relevant objectives and policies, and perhaps the main point about the objective in paragraph 38 is that it's wider than the Tauriko business estate. It's an objective from the operative city plan, but it's wider than the Tauriko business estate, and it's looking at promoting strong land use and access relationships in the southwest corridor of the city, rather than just providing for this plan change area. Down at 42, I just talk a bit about the role of uncertainty. It's not uncommon in planning practices to be a bit uncertain about exactly what is going to happen and when, but that is part of the Section 32 evaluation that you need to carry out, which is the risk of acting or not acting if there's uncertain or insufficient information about the subject matter of the provisions. And in a Tauranga context, of course, there is, as Mr. Mead pointed out, already a shortage of dwellings. I think he said we need 5,000 at present or so, either now or very soon. So the risk of compromising that development, of course, needs to be weighed up. And in paragraph 43, I talk about the compensation issue. And the point being made is that compensation entitlement arises when land is acquired or taken. And when that happens, affected landowners are entitled to full compensation. And that means that they're basically left in a no better or worse position than they were before the public work commenced. So either the current landowner will be compensated in accordance with the Public Works Act, or if the land is unsold, the purchaser or the new owner will be compensated in accordance with the Public Works Act. So no one misses out on compensation is the short point. In paragraph 44, I just reiterate the benefits of future proofing that corridor, and in particular, preserving that ability to construct 12,000 new dwellings, which is a lot in the Tauranga context and very important strategically going forward. And in my conclusion there, I just reiterate really that these are legal parameters in the framework that you're operating under, but it's a matter of planning judgment for you to decide exactly how that plan should look in the end. So happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you for that. And a couple of questions for you, and then I'm happy for Ms. Drew to come back in if she feels that's a planning issue she can provide some further clarification on. So is it my understanding, and I'd like you to tell me if I've got this wrong, that the ODP notation for a 38-metre wide width doesn't actually enable the Tauranga City Council to construct a road within that width of corridor to access the Upper Belt Road urban growth area, that a further regulatory process would need to be gone through, either by way of designation or resource consents? Is that right or wrong?
Yes, that's correct. There's nothing about this notation that constitutes a planning approval to undertake an activity. As you say, a designation is a planning approval and a resource consent is a planning approval, but this is not.
So the material impact of the ODP notation at this stage relates more to triggering resource consent requirements if the owners of land within that notation wish to undertake development or activities that don't exist. Is that its primary function?
That's right. They carry on as they are now under existing use rights. If they wanted to do something different that is inconsistent with the ODP, because it encroaches into the road widening, for example, they would need resource consent, and that would be from memory, that would be a restricted discretionary subdivision consent or a discretionary land use consent, depending on what the activity is.
And so just one last question. So if the notation was to remain on the ODP as is currently notified with the 38 metre width, and then if in the future Tauranga City wished to develop a wide road within that area to service the Upper Belt Road growth area and went through a designation or consent process, would that would trigger, or would that trigger Public Works Act compensation processes?
No, not the process of putting a designation on the land itself, for example. It's the process of actually taking or acquiring the land that triggers compensation. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thanks very much. Thank you for that, and thanks for the legal submissions that you pre-circulated. That's all very helpful.
Thank you. Bye.
And so now, Ms. Drew, anything you wish to add by way of sort of wrap up before we break for lunch?
I've spent this time looking at the TCC plan to see what its preferred use of terminology is. And it unhelpfully uses a bit of both. It does define Indigenous, but it is clearly lends in favour of natives in terms of references. Including some requirements in, there's a reference to natives actually in that subdivision rule for the Tauriko business estate. It doesn't refer specifically to the matter we're talking about, but you'll recall that I brought your attention to the clause C3, which talked about riparian protection, and that's the one that's been also changed to include the Omanawa stream, so that it talks about native planting. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Anything else?
No, that's it from this side. Thank you.
All right, so what we'll do now is we'll break for lunch. And what is the time now? So, Ms. Ham, if we came back at 1:30, is that sufficient time for you to have something to eat and do whatever discussions you need to do with your client?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
All right, so we'll do that. We'll stick to the schedule. We'll come back at 1:30. Thank you. right, good afternoon, everyone. It's close enough to 1:30. I think we can reconvene the hearing, and at this stage, I'm hearing the proponent's right of reply. Ms. Ham.
Thank you. So I will deal firstly with the stormwater issues raised by the Regional Council, and secondly with the issue of the Belk Road widening. With respect to the stormwater issues, I'm going to propose that after the hearing concludes today, Mr. Grace and Ms. Drew just liaise with regard to a set of agreed provisions, because I think we're at that point and it would be most helpful for you to have that. But I am going to take you through the suggestions. So there are really 5 outstanding matters between the applicant and Ms. Drew. The first of those relates to the policy. So that's 12 capital E point 1.3.1 small a Roman 2. Mr. Grace's view agrees with that of Ms. Drew that the current wording is appropriate. And in my submission, I would add to that that it is appropriate given the stage at which this provision kicks in, which is in relation to stormwater management through subdivision and development. So in other words, we've already been through the plan change, which is to give effect to the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, and we're down more here in the level of detail. So the applicant's preference is to retain the wording that has been notified within Plan Change 35. If, having said that, the Commissioner is minded to amend that wording, then the applicant is suggesting that it specifically relate to the central drain. So it would say, where practicable, integrate with and minimise degradation of the central drain. The next provision or bundle of provisions is the new provision Q that was suggested by Mr. Grace in his evidence. Ms. Drew, in preference to that, suggested a new N Roman 1. Now the applicant is happy with that wording.
Happy with the N Roman 1 wording?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Yep, good.
So it's just a matter, I think, of recording that in a set of provisions for the Commissioner. Sticking with the same provision, which is N, Roman 2 is the provision where the Regional Council sought that wording be added in relation to roads. I think it was including roads, but high vehicle roads of 5,000 vehicles or more. Look, there is a point of principle at which I have to make the submission that I question whether it's necessary to add more words, given that it's an inclusive provision. But nevertheless, the applicant will accept the suggestion put forward by Ms. Drew, which is essentially to add the words including Belk Road. The fourth provision I think we're up to was in relation to original clause Q, and that was the suggestion to add the words planted in natives. The applicant's happy with that addition, and we agree that the words apostrophes in natives, close apostrophes, is most appropriate. With respect to the matters of control, that's provision 12 capital E point 3.2.6 subclause E. The applicant had suggested deleting the words including its ecological values. Ms. Drew's view is that that should be reinstated, and so the applicant is prepared to go along with that. And in terms of the matters raised by the Regional Council, that lastly brings us to Appendix 18D, where the planners for the applicant and the regional council appear to be in agreement, including the addition of a notation. So the wording that we are suggesting is alongside native riparian planting, quote, bracket 5 metre minimum width, close bracket. The word, it's hard to read, but at the bottom of the plan where it says 5 metres, it appears to say min in brackets.
Yep.
Hence why we're suggesting minimum width. And I haven't checked scope for that amendment, but it's at least a consequential amendment in any event. So that concludes what I have to say in reply in respect of the regional council's submissions. Any other changes that we haven't referred to or that I haven't dealt with just now, the position is as per my opening and Mr. Grace's evidence. So I turn then to the question of the Belk Road widening. We've spent a lot of time on this. I'll just recap some of the things we've heard today. With respect to Upper Belk Road, it appears based on Mr. Mead's evidence that we're looking at within a 10-year timeframe for that to be structure planned and rezoned. We've had evidence about the mechanism, whether it's a plan notation or a designation. And it's certainly my submission that the plan notation is a valid mechanism. It's really no different to a structure plan, which some district plans use and then have provisions saying development must occur in accordance with the structure plan. You asked about the width that the road would need to be developed for if we were just dealing with stage 4 TBE. And the position on that is that based on traffic volumes, if we put Upper Belk Road aside, it would be 22 metres in width. But that extends out to 27 metres, where based on traffic volumes, it becomes a higher traffic volume road. And the trigger for that would be the development of Upper Belk Road urban growth area. I said at the start of the day that Element IMF was keen to settle on a mechanism that was both efficient, but also address the submitters' concerns. Now, Mr. Grace supports the planning notation, and you certainly have planning evidence before you of that. But my client's instructions are that in order to deliver a mechanism which is efficient, but also addresses the submitters' concerns, it would like you to make a recommendation removing the road widening notation from the Smythe properties. Now, that will require the reply to submit to you an amended plan showing that, so that you have that, should you agree with that request. I don't think I need to say any more on that. You have plenty of evidence before you as to the validity of the mechanisms. Probably the only other matter I would say is that TCC confirmed that, so Mr. Fisher confirmed that a further process would be required in order to give effect to the road widening in terms of either a development consent or a designation process. So from Element IMF's perspective, the absence of the road notation doesn't particularly compromise the delivery of the road at a future date, given that the council acknowledges that that future process will still be required. In conclusion, therefore, Element IMF will be asking you to make a recommendation to adopt the plan change subject to the amendments I've outlined just now. I'm going to ask Mr. Grace and Ms. Drew to settle the stormwater provisions, and then as part of the reply, I will also need to produce an amended ODP and an amended 18D with the notation on it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very clear and very helpful. At the risk of appearing to be a dog with a bone, just going back to these issues of integrate and interface with, are you familiar with that terminology from other plans that you've dealt with, and particularly the word interface? It's not one I've come across.
No, look, no, I'm not familiar with the wording. I had a look at it. My concern with the regional council wording is that we sort of drive back more into the policies 6 and 7 of the NPSFM, as Ms. Drew mentioned. So I understand the integration point, but I think in the context of the provision we're dealing with, the wording that is in there is workable. But if it causes the Commissioner concern, then the applicant would prefer the suggestion of Ms. Drew, but focusing perhaps on the central drain.
I understand that. And in terms of the Ms. Drew and Mr. Grace putting their heads together on some wording, it would be useful to include the regional council's planning advisor in that as well. I don't see any good reason for excluding them from the discussion.
Certainly, it just may mean that it's a more complicated version that comes to you, identifying areas of agreement and disagreement.
Yeah, it's very few provisions that Mr. Grace and Ms. Drew were going to discuss anyway, weren't there? It was only one
Well,
or
it
two,
is,
wasn't
but I
it?
suppose what I'm saying is it doesn't include, for example, some of the relief sought by the regional council with respect to the air quality advice note, for example.
Oh, yeah, look, I'm not concerned about that, but issues where Mr. Grace and Ms. Drew were going to confer or caucus on wording, on those issues only, I'd appreciate you involving the regional council
Sure.
planner. I'm not asking you to broaden it out to everything else the regional council wanted, just where these two are going to talk about a provision, if that could include the regional.
Certainly, yep.
And you look forward to receiving the amended ODP, just so I can see what that might look like, ODP map. And just want to acknowledge and appreciate the instructions that your client gave you regarding that. So thank you for that. But other than that, no further questions. Timing for the planners to do their stuff.
I suggested to Mr. Grace that if we were finishing now, he could talk to Ms. Drew now.
Yep. Ms. Holden's nodding her head, so I look forward to receiving something tomorrow from you. Excellent.
Yes. Thank you.
All right, so that brings us to the conclusion of this part of the process. So for anyone who hasn't been involved in the plan change hearing before, what happens now is that I'll receive the further information that Ms. Ham just outlined, and then I'll go away and deliberate with myself and write up a decision, which will then be promulgated in due course. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance and for providing all the information, evidence and legal submissions that you have done. It's been an interesting process. So thank you.